Well, this is great. Well, glad to see so many students who are here today.
太好
Yeah.
了。
So, and Ashley, thank you so much for making the arrangements.
Thank you everyone for attending our discussion today. Today we are all very glad to have Dean John Smagula Sangguoya 老师 from Temple Law School to give us the discussion about his experience of Chinese study and what you can get from learning Chinese, what it will help in your job hunting, and how you can further improve your Chinese. Welcome everyone, and thank you so much, Sang 老师.
Thank you. Thank you. And of course, thank you to Zhao Laoshi for inviting me, for Ashley for doing all the preparation work, and of course to Fu Laoshi for all your support of our Confucius Institute. And of course, it's always my pleasure to be able to support our combined work. So
thank you.
The topic of today's talk is grow your future, grow your mind. It's really not a talk. This is more of a conversation. And I'm just going to share with you some of my impressions, having studied Chinese for nearly 30 years. And so, but I had to start somewhere. And I remember very vividly my days starting Chinese, studying Chinese when I was in your position. So I did sit in the same seat you are in now, and I remember it. And so I'm going to just share some of the things with you because really the purpose of our discussion, our conversation today is to encourage you so you can appreciate the value of Chinese, but also have the inspiration to continue with your studies. So again, my name is John. I'm the Assistant Dean of Temple Law School. I lived in China for about 10 years, directing Temple Law School's program in Beijing. And so if anybody here is interested in coming to law school, please let me know. I would love to have more Chinese speakers in the building. And it's just more about how we can continue to work together and share our common interest in Chinese. So I start with asking you a question, because we've all come to Chinese as a language for different reasons. Sometimes it's interest, sometimes it's family, sometimes it's school. But really, what brings you to Chinese? Because all of our stories are different. And it's a little bit different, I think, from studying Western languages. So Chinese is my third language, Spanish is my second language. And Spanish was something I studied more because it was part of school and it was just part of my academic background. Whereas I studied Chinese by choice. And I think that is very common among a lot of Chinese speakers. So as we think about studying Chinese, really the most important reason is your story. My story is, when I was in high school back in the day, I had a high school teacher, a world history teacher who just was teaching about the different countries of the world. And when she got to China, she just lit up and she became enthusiastic. She became really excited. And that enthusiasm then spread to me. And that was the seed that got me interested in learning to speak Chinese. Back then, though, there weren't the resources we have today. We didn't have online. We didn't have Confucius Institutes. We didn't have high school Chinese classes. So I had to learn it on my own until I got to college. And so then from there, I also learned that Chinese is not just a language or something different. It's also about a people and a culture, as with studying any language. But as I was going to Chinese restaurants growing up, and I was expressing my interest in the language to the workers at those restaurants, they just unconditionally embraced me. And I felt like I felt the warmth of the culture. And that propelled me to want to learn more as well. And this is all at high school, and I grew up in a small town in Connecticut, which didn't have a lot of diversity. So, but over time, just with my exposure to this teacher and then, just the warmth of the people, that just propelled my interest to want to learn more. And so, and I think many of us have stories. Sometimes it's a book or a movie. So in my generation, a lot of people read a book called The Good Earth by Pearl Buck. And that, I think, really inspired a lot of people to want to learn about China. So really, when you're thinking about Chinese, what's your story? And your story is really what's going to define how Chinese could become a language and a culture and a skill that can accompany you on your entire life journey. So I'll just share with you some of my impressions about why you should study Chinese. Or not really you should study Chinese, but why we should want to study Chinese. And there are personal reasons and there's professional reasons. So the professional reasons, I think, are very, very well known. Of course, Chinese is the most widely spoken language in the world. So by various estimates, about 20%, 1/5 of the world's population speaks Chinese. And that's not limited to mainland China. This would be Greater China. And then, of course, there are large Chinese communities in many other countries, mostly in Southeast Asia. And so speaking English as a native language plus Chinese is really the ticket to being able to communicate all over the world. And so I think just by virtue of the numbers. And what's very interesting about this is that much of China is not bilingual. So even though many people, students as a standard basis are studying English in China, it's not as commonly spoken in society as it is in other countries where English is a second language, which means you could travel all over China and you could speak Chinese all day, every day, and not, and have these great opportunities to build relationships and practice your language. And that's also true with many Chinese who are in the diaspora, living here in Philadelphia or anywhere abroad, that very often the preference is to speak in Chinese. So there's great opportunities to learn, to practice, to exchange. That's not always the case with other languages. So by the numbers, of course, Chinese is the most widely spoken language in the world. English, is probably the most widely spoken second language in the world, but that's not true in all countries. So I know many of you who are students, you're thinking about what am I going to do after graduation? And you're always looking for ways to improve your resume. And so if we look at the market right now, more and more CEOs are speaking Chinese as a second language. On a regular basis, I am asked by alumni from Temple who have law degrees or business degrees, and they say to me, I'm in a business now, I'm in a law firm now, and I need to learn Chinese. How do I do it? That's new. That wasn't the case years ago. So I think overall, when we're thinking about learning the language, this is a great opportunity for you because it's so highly desired in the market. And you look at someone like Mark Zuckerberg, who is learning Chinese. He went to Tsinghua a few years ago and actually gave a talk in Chinese. And you think of somebody like Mark Zuckerberg, who at Facebook is always looking to the future, is always looking for new opportunities. I think that's a sign among many. But I think if you do a lot of reading in the business literature, in the success literature, you will see that Chinese is considered to be the most important language for future executives to learn. And of course, just in my position, I've always received, phone calls from headhunters, from recruiters, saying they're looking for Chinese speaking talent. And so I think that's just indicative of the way the market is. And so it's also just, reflects the role of China in the world. And so the number of people who are speaking Chinese are desired by many multinational corporations, law firms, other employers, government agencies. It's just unbelievable where the opportunities are. But what's interesting is there's not much competition for those jobs. So because there's not enough of Chinese speakers. So that actually gives you an incredible advantage. So why does China matter? Well, I think we all know. There's many reasons. I'll just give a few here. China is the second largest economy in the world. By some accounts, it's the largest. So depending on how we count. Of course, it's one of the largest trading partners of the United States. It always will be, just given the nature of the economies and what each of our competitive strengths are. Many United States businesses are doing business in China. And they have long-term investments there. So the American Chamber of Commerce in China is a very, very powerful force, has hundreds and hundreds of members. More and more American businesses have business interests in China, but they don't necessarily have Chinese-speaking staff. And they do everything through translation, or they do everything through other means. But at the end of the day, there's more American business, and not just American, but international business. And when you speak Chinese, you're not just limited to working for American companies doing business in China. There are European companies, there's other companies that are doing work there. And you look at even Chinese initiatives all over the world, whatever they may be, Belt and Road, those kinds of things, they're bilingual, but of course there's a Chinese base. So even if you're not from the United States, or you want to work for an international operation, be it a public or a private company or an organization, there are plenty of opportunities for Chinese speakers. Of course, the Chinese economy is growing. And so, and because of that, that means that will only provide more opportunities, you know, and then it looks great on your resume. Anytime I receive a resume that shows somebody speaks Chinese, it instantly gets my attention, in part because Chinese skills are rare, in that when you're applying for a job, and if they do require Chinese as a language requirement, you can be sure that there won't be as many applicants as for a job where there is no language requirement. And so that puts you at a competitive advantage. In fact, the job that I have at Temple, it required Chinese language skill, which means there were very few applicants that were qualified for the job. And so I'd like to think I would have gotten it anyway, but it's always good to put yourself in a position where you will have less competition. And because Chinese language skills are so rare in the market right now, but there's a strong desire for them, you're actually setting yourself up for success. So even if you go to the Career Center and talk to a counselor there about what are the opportunities for Chinese speakers, if you meet among our alumni, you'll see that it is a growing a need in China and in the United States for bilingual talent. So those are some of the professional opportunities that I think are well known, but that's also part of my own story, because the jobs that I got where I am, you know, be it my Wall Street law firm job before I came to Temple or my job here at Temple, they were both, I had an advantage for both jobs simply because I spoke Chinese. And so I think I'm a witness to this phenomenon, and this was, you know, over 10 years ago. So and the market has only grown ever since then. So that's why I think the first thing to think about is learning Chinese will just open up a world of opportunity for you, and it's a world that's not just limited to China. It's a world that's, you know, well beyond China, and so I think that will provide you with a platform and an expertise that will put you in a really good position in the future to capture some terrific opportunities that will be exciting and meaningful. So that's the professional stuff, you know, but let's talk about the personal reasons, because learning Chinese isn't just for improving your resume. Sure, it's helpful for that. It sure will help you to get a job, but really you want to have some fun with it. And there are a lot of personal reasons why you should study Chinese. Some reasons you may not have even thought about. And so, you know, I look at my own journey and my own interest, but, you know, and I've spoken to other Chinese speakers as well. And, you know, the first thing that's the most interesting about learning Chinese, I think, is that you acquire a new thought process. In fact, that's true for studying any foreign language, but with Chinese, that's more so. So when you learn to say Spanish, you have to think a different way to communicate in Spanish because the thought processes among Spanish speakers and English speakers are not the same. With Chinese, that's also true, but even more true because there's fewer linguistic similarities between Chinese and English, between Chinese culture and American culture. So language study is not just vocabulary and grammar. Because if that's all you'll learn, you'll never be able to communicate in a language. So you might be able to take tests, but you won't necessarily be able to communicate effectively. And another thing about Chinese is that it is very focused on China and Chinese culture. You can learn English, but not necessarily learn a lot about the United States. You know, you could, but with Chinese, it's a little different because there's so much about the Chinese thought process that's within the Chinese language, but there's also customs and there's also traditions. And then of course, the characters are a very different way of writing. And you also learn about the Chinese way of life, much of which will have an impact on your thinking after you study Chinese. And I find that in my own world, having learned and studied the Chinese thought process, in addition to the way of thinking and the culture and the traditions and the history, it's expanded my own way of reasoning. I look at problems differently now as a teacher, as a lawyer, as a professional, because I now have acquired a second thought process. I haven't changed my thought process, but I've expanded it. And that's one of the greatest benefits of studying Chinese because you're expanding in a very different way. Because in Chinese, there's different ways of communicating. There's a lot of different ways of understanding the language and the people. And once you acquire that thought process, you actually are improving your own thinking. And so this reminds me of a quote of Judge Oliver Wendell Holmes, where he said, well, this has been attributed to Judge Oliver Wendell Holmes, where he said, once the mind is expanded, it could never return to its former size. And I think that's especially true when you study Chinese. Even if you study Chinese for a few years and give up, you will have an expanded mind, because you'll be seeing things differently, you'll be looking at things differently, different ways of communication, different ways of describing things. As you start to learn the idioms, much of which have a sense of humor to them, you'll expand your own way of making jokes. So there's a great benefit to studying Chinese. As studying any foreign language, you're expanding your thought process. But with Chinese, you're expanding your thought process more. And again, I'm coming to this from the perspective of having studied Spanish first and then Chinese second. So it's a great form of exercise. And one of the reasons why I think Chinese is so cool is it's, in English, we tend to be more clinical. We use mostly the left brain, whereas with Chinese, you use both. And I think that's another reason why it expands your mind. And when you think about the writing is not just writing letters, but it's actually an individual character. And each individual character has its root in some sort of a design, in some sort of drawing. And so when you learn Chinese, you're not just expanding your thought process and your reasoning abilities, but you're also improving your brain power and even your artistic skills. Because if you really do practice the writing, you're also going to be practicing your artistic abilities, which is less true with languages that are based on alphabets. So I think with Chinese, you're also using and engaging more of your brain to study and to communicate, especially in reading and writing. And so that will increase your brain power for many, many years to come. And I found that that's been especially true in my own case. Of course, there's reasons for personal growth. I mean, what are your interests? And we all have our own interests as to what brought us to Chinese. These are just some examples of things that I have seen from people who have studied Chinese. Some people have, if you can speak Chinese and then you're very interested in the martial arts, and then on a trip to China, you go to Shaolin Temple and you can communicate with the monks directly in Chinese. I mean, that's the coolest thing in the world. That's something I did. And, it was just fascinating because we're able to really have some interesting conversations about the philosophy and the methods of martial arts in Chinese, because so much of that could get lost in translation. Of course, cooking. Of course, there's the stereotype. One of the biggest questions I always get is, when you go to Chinese restaurants, you can hear what they're saying. I mean, yeah, that is fun. But at the same time, you're also able to communicate in the Chinese restaurants. And, you can ask questions about the food or the dishes or the ideas. So a lot of people come to studying Chinese through cooking, which in my opinion is one of the best in the world and certainly one of the healthiest. Another thing that's interesting about Chinese is there's a whole world of the internet in China that we don't really have exposure to. There's, Bilibili is one of the popular video sites. Weibo is, in WeChat, we all kind of know. But when we're thinking about the online spaces and you're interested in interacting with people in Chinese all over the world, well, there's a lot of spaces that English speakers don't know anything about. And so, for example, in my own world, I do a lot of video blogging and I put all of my videos up on Bilibili, and I have a lot of interesting, conversations with people who see my videos on Bilibili, because that seems to be a platform that, where there's a lot of visitors to my videos. So China has more video platforms than we do in the West, or more major video platforms than we do. So, but then there's games and there's other things where you can get involved that are not commonly accessible. Just a conversation with a student from China will expose you to a number of apps and websites that are commonly used in China that we just don't know about. But when you learn the language, you can have access to that, and that expands you to a broader realm of communication. Of course, there's the art, there's the history and the culture. All of that, kind of goes without saying when you study another language. But when you speak Chinese, you can see a lot more in it. Because a lot of Chinese art will have, calligraphy, or will have other expressions in there, and you can actually look and you can understand it a little bit better. Or if you want to talk to somebody about it, you can talk about it in Chinese and you can understand a little better. So that, of course, is open to you travel. China is, I lived in China for 10 years. I have been to every province in China, and each one has its differences. And the language was just critical because I was able to explore things, talk to people, and really learn about the culture in ways that I would not have otherwise done. And you know, a lot of people say to me, "Oh, you lived in China for 10 years. Didn't you travel all over Asia?" And I didn't. You know, I've been to Temple's Japan campus twice, and that's about it. All the rest of my travel was in China. And it's just because there's so much there, from the natural beauty, from the ability to interact. And I think that's part of the travel, you know, benefit as well. But even like last summer, I was in Rome, you know, I was visiting our Temple Rome campus, and I went on a tour in a museum, and, you know, there were just a lot of different tour groups, lots of people, but there was a Chinese language tour group that only had 5 people in it. So I joined that group and I had the tour in Chinese, which was a very intimate tour. I was able to ask a lot of questions and make some interesting friends. That can happen to you all over the world. Whereas, you know, you can do that in English as well, but it's not the same dynamic. So, of course, health, traditional Chinese medicine. So much of traditional Chinese medicine requires an understanding of the language. And so if you're going to be, you know, interested in alternative medicine or traditional Chinese medicine, and you can actually speak with the practitioner in Chinese, because there's a lot of terminology that just doesn't translate. You actually have to learn it. And so that's another benefit that comes from studying Chinese, is you can actually get some health benefits. And of course, you know, those of you who know me, you know that my hobby is tea. I developed tea as a hobby living in China. Before that, I didn't really care much about it. And so, you know, and I drink a lot of tea each and every day. And, but so much of tea culture in China involves the language, just different words and terminology that are used to describe tea and the culture and how it's used. And so it can really open up so many different things for personal growth. Now, granted, you could study all this stuff without the language, but when you have the language, you can get to a level of depth that you would not without the language. And so it goes beyond being a hobby, where you can actually, or you can develop the hobby to a level that most practitioners would not. So there's reasons for personal growth. So a lot of people are afraid of Chinese. And a lot of people ask me that question. They say, "Oh my goodness, I'd love to learn Chinese, but it's so hard." You know, you look at the State Department standards and it's like, yeah, Chinese, Japanese, Korean, and Arabic are the 4 most difficult languages in the world. And then you look at the numbers and whoa, there's 80,000 Chinese characters, maybe more. Actually, no, there are more than 80,000 Chinese characters. So, but it's all a question of perspective. I have yet to meet anybody who has learned all 80,000 Chinese characters, even in China. So, but really, if you want to talk about day-to-day communication, 3,500 is pretty much what you need. Like if you have 3,500 characters under your belt, which in Chinese is a little bit between intermediate and advanced, you can do relatively well in China. You know, the HSK, I know some of you are taking that or studying for that. You know, the top level only is 5,000 characters. And so level 6. So I think if you're, but at the end of the day, if you're between 3,500 and 5,000, that is putting you in a good position to have some advanced conversations. And of course, it takes time. You start with what you know, and little by little, you build on it. But it's a matter of perspective. And it's like English. You don't need to understand Shakespeare to be able to read and understand modern English. And that would also be true for Chinese. Sure, there are some Chinese or traditional Chinese characters and expressions that have worked their way into modern day Chinese. But at the end of the day, with 3,500 characters, I think you're in a good position to be able to have some highly functional conversations. And that would be true for any language. So if you were going to learn Spanish, that's kind of a goal, or Italian as well. So, you know, that's really the number that I think that's out there. So it's difficult. And yes, the State Department does categorize it as a difficult language, but that's no reason to be afraid of it. It's just a matter of recognizing that you are going to have to spend some time to study it. So let's talk about just how difficult it is, because it is, but it's not. And so, yeah, what makes Chinese difficult is the writing system. That is absolutely true. And so, you know, there's no alphabet, you know, the characters, either you know them or you don't. And so over time, you can gradually start to intuit what some characters are. But, you know, it's the characters that I think make Chinese more distinctly difficult than many other languages. Then there's the tones. There are other tonal languages, but in Chinese, the tones will make or break you. And all of us as foreigners who are studying Chinese, we've all made mistakes with tones that have caused misunderstandings, some of those misunderstandings that can be very, very embarrassing. That's happened to me. And even though I've studied Chinese for almost 30 years, it still happens to me that I'm using the wrong tone. It's just the way it is. But Chinese speakers my experience have been very tolerant and very understanding, including many Chinese people themselves who don't always speak with the correct tones. So I think, we still want to strive for that standard of excellence, but my experience is that there's a lot more tolerance of non-native speakers learning the tones. And so, and again, with practice, you do master them. The idioms, idioms in Chinese are more difficult than idioms in English. Idioms in English tend to be kind of simple. They tend to be kind of, easy to remember. In Chinese, it does require some time to learn the 4-character, the 8-character idioms. But once you do, you actually see how they help you, because each idiom has a really, not really, but a lot of idioms have really complex meanings. So with just 4 characters, you can express a very complex concept, whereas in English, you would actually need several sentences. So in many ways, when you learn certain idioms that mean very complicated things, or, with subtle meanings or nuanced meanings, you can still be able to use the idioms to save you time and space in reading and writing. If you're going to learn Chinese or classical Chinese, that's a whole separate thing. And so I've never learned it. I've studied a little bit of it, but if I were to read classical Chinese, I'd understand very, very little of it. I would always need some sort of modern interpretation. That's not to say I can't function in Chinese. I can, and there are some classical Chinese influences on modern Chinese. But at the same time, Chinese as a language, it hasn't evolved as quickly as English. English changes a lot. And English has changed very quickly, between ancient English and, Old English and then modern English. English is a very elastic language that absorbs other languages very easily and continues to evolve. That's less true for Chinese. So that means that even if I do go back and look at some classical Chinese texts, I can't understand some of the stuff. And so I think that means it's, there are benefits, but again, you don't necessarily need to master classical Chinese to be able to speak in modern Chinese. Now, compared to Spanish, which is my first language, and Italian, which is my 4th language, Chinese has no tenses. And so one of the most difficult things about a lot of languages is the tenses and making sure that they match. Chinese doesn't have that. So there are ways to express past and future, and you learn those as you study the language, but a lot of it is also based on context. And so, whereas that's, so all of those verb conjugation charts and things that I need in Spanish, don't need in Chinese. So, and there's no cases. Yeah, there are masculine and feminine based on context, but as far as nouns and matching and adjectives and matching masculine to masculine and irregulars and all of that, that doesn't exist in Chinese. Same with genders. So even though you are investing more time on the front end with some of these other things, at the end, as you're studying, there are other things that you're not going to have to deal with that you would have to deal with in other Western languages. So the grammar, some people say it's simple, some people say it's hard. I think to many people, it's very logical. And so once you learn the basics of the grammar, you will be able to understand it better as time goes on, because there is a logic to Chinese. Just how do you say delicious in Chinese? Well, hao, shi, right? So good and eat, put it together, delicious. And once your brain gets used to making those connections, this is that left-right brain when you add in how to write that, well, you're gonna learn how to do that yourself. And sometimes I will put 2 words together which actually mean something, and I don't recall ever having learned that word. So over time, your brain will do that automatically as you learn more Chinese, and that just makes it easier. So, and that's why I say you make more connections, accelerating your language acquisition. So the difference, I think, between learning Spanish and Chinese in this regard is Spanish, you're able, in my view, you're able to make continual progress. And after a short period of time, you can have meaningful conversations in Spanish. That's not necessarily true for Chinese. My experience with Chinese is you have to do a bigger upfront investment of learning the tones, of learning the sound system, of learning the writing. And when you make that, so as you're investing in all of that upfront work, you're not necessarily learning a lot of vocabulary or a lot of other ways to express yourself. But then once you get that base, there comes a point where you can leave that platform and you raise up. And whereas my experience with Spanish is you gradually just keep moving. With Chinese, it's more, there's a plateau, then you have a sudden rise and another plateau. Now, of course, everyone's different, but the thing to remember about Chinese is it just takes longer. One of the analogies that I often use is in Western culture, or not Western culture, but like in a garden, if you planted a tomato plant, you could plant it that year. And within a few months, you could be eating the tomatoes from that plant. So that's kind of like Spanish. Chinese is like a tea bush. So when you plant a tea bush, the bush actually takes 3 to 4 years to grow before you can start harvesting it. But once you have that harvest, the tea bush will last for 99 years. So that's an interesting analogy. This is my analogy, but I'm sure there's other ways to express this concept, but I think it's one where when you learn a language like Chinese, it does require that upfront investment. But once you've acquired it and you've acquired the tones and the sound system and the basics of the writing, you'll find that you'll be able to accelerate in ways that's not necessarily true in other languages. So let's look at the fear. And this reminds me of a quote by Mark Twain, which I've had a whole lot of worries in my life, most of which never happened. So when you're thinking about your fear, oh, I'm so afraid of Chinese. I'm afraid it's difficult. I'm afraid I'm not going to do well on the exam. I'm afraid I'm going to make mistakes when I speak. Recognize that that's just fear. But, fear is like, or worry is like you're paying interest on a debt that you may never owe. So, just feel the fear and do it anyway. And recognize that a lot of what you were worried about probably wasn't really worth worrying about. That, yeah, there are some difficulties, but when you put it into perspective and give it the right interpretation, you will find yourself in a much better position. So another thing about Chinese that I think is really fun is you can make friends in ways that you don't necessarily do so with other cultures. And so, just living in China, I'm always being asked, oh, I would love to meet some friends who are from the United States, even if they don't, and then they very often don't speak English. They just want to make American friends or European friends or whatever country they're interested in. And I think that is something that's not as common with other languages. So for example, I've studied Italian as well. And when I was in Rome last summer, I had to go out of my way to find people to speak Italian to, because everybody spoke English. It was just an international city. People would speak to me in English all the time, even if I spoke to them in Italian. So, I had to go way out of Rome into the countryside to find people to speak Italian to. That is not the case in China. So you can be speaking Chinese, in the major cities with all sorts of people. Yeah, there are people who will want to be speaking to you in English, and that's fair. So, but there's a great interest in China, I think, to really want to engage on a friendship level with people in the outside world. And that, I think, makes it really interesting to learn Chinese because they might want to learn something new. And you don't even have to go to China for that. You can do so right here in Philadelphia. So for example, I live in Northeast Philadelphia, and I live in a section of Northeast Philadelphia where more and more Chinese families are moving in. So I live in Mayfair, which is estimated to be about 20% Chinese right now. So that brings in the Chinese grocery stores and the Chinese restaurants. And as I'm there, I can talk to people in Chinese. And so who very often don't speak English or don't speak English that well. So you don't even need to go to China to have these opportunities to speak and have interesting conversations because there's always that willingness. Of course, I can do that in Spanish. I can do that with Spanish speakers as well. It's just just my own experience has been that there's a difference, that there's that interest to engage, there's that interest to have conversations just because it's so unusual to find somebody who's a non-native speaker of Chinese. And so that's what makes it really interesting to me. And the reason why I think this is important also has geopolitical reasons. The United States and China, the relationship, as we've been following in the news, it has its ups and downs. And so I've often believed that it's the personal connections between the Chinese and Americans that will be the bridge. There's always going to be differing geopolitical goals, and that's just the way the world works. But that happens at a different level. At a personal level, a people-to-people level, we can do a lot to make positive contributions. And when you become friends and you build these relationships, you're actually moving a larger system in a positive direction. So I love this quote that's been attributed to Sophocles: "One word frees us from all the pain of life. That word is love." And so when you approach Chinese from that perspective, that really it's got professional reasons, it's got personal reasons, it's got even diplomatic reasons, where I could be learning from and communicating with a country where, you know, it's the most important partner for the United States in so many ways, but at the same time, there's a competition there, but competition isn't necessarily a bad thing, depending on, you know, what the environment is. And I learned this in China. I was once speaking to a student who said, you know, the United States should welcome a strong economic China, because it's like Americans, you love football. And if you're a really strong football team and you're only playing weaker teams, you're never going to improve yourself. So why do you not take that mentality to a more global level? And so I know that's a simple analogy. I know there's a lot of complexities involved in that question, but at the same time, that doesn't have much of an impact on my ability to build personal relationships and friendships with Chinese who are very often willing to interact and have culture exchange with us. And so, and you can build some very interesting, warm, rich friendships that are based on, you know, where you're communicating in Chinese. And that, I think, is another benefit of speaking the language. And everywhere I've traveled in China, to every province, I've been to the cities, to the countryside, I've always been unconditionally embraced. And I've had some very interesting conversations. And I have to always go back and thank that high school teacher for her passion for Chinese, which then spread to me, which then became part of my own life journey. And so that's why I'm a teacher today, because of that teacher. But at the same time, I also want to encourage you to think, okay, maybe Chinese could become part of my life journey so I can have equally enriching experiences and robust friendships. You know, if I can do it, so can you. You know, I went through studying Chinese the same way you did. You know, now you have technology, now we have the internet, now we have all sorts of other things. But really, you know, I've met plenty of people who have studied Chinese of all different skill levels, of all different backgrounds, and they're able to do it. And so, you know, if we can do it, you can do it. So really, you just face the fear and do it anyway. And I think that will help, you know, move you along. So I'm going to leave you on a quote. I think we all know what this is. A journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. And that's really where we are with Chinese. And even every day as I study the language, I'm like, okay, this is a new journey. I'm going to take another step. But I think that's a very wise proverb that has its origins in Chinese. And so, but at the same time, it is a way for us to keep ourselves motivated, recognizing that there is a process. So that's what I wanted to offer you today. And I see that there's a few questions here. And oh, you're asking, I think Bilibili is just the name of the video website. And so I think that's, I don't know, I think it has, I'm not sure what it means, or if it's just, you know, just the sound, it kind of sounds cool. So, but maybe one of the teachers could answer that question. So yeah. So I'm not sure if it has any meaning, but maybe someone else in the room could answer that question. So that's really all I had to share with you today. So of course, I'm certainly happy to answer any questions, or hear your stories as well about what brings you here and why you have an interest in learning or studying Chinese. And if there's anything I can do to provide you some advice or some guidance or some inspiration on how to continue with your journey. So again, thank you so much for coming today, and thank you for the inspiration, for the invitation. 非常感谢. And now my time is yours.
谢谢桑老师精彩的讲座，我们受益匪浅。我觉得不光是学生，我个人还有在座的各位老师也受益匪浅。谢谢桑老师。大家 have a good night. We'll see you next time.
Good night.
好，谢谢桑老师。
多保重，多多保重。
我这也有枸杞。
那就很好。
好，
啊，张峰，谢谢你啊，你辛苦了。
再见。谢谢桑老师，再会。
你辛苦了。
哎。